Welcome to Educational Alpha. I'm Bill Kelly, CEO of Chrys Association, and your host, bringing you on-the-ground conversations with business leaders, educators, and industry colleagues from around the globe. Educational Alpha is sponsored by iCapital, the financial technology company with the mission to power the world's alternative investment marketplace. Part innovator, part educator, and part navigator of the alternatives industry, iCapital offers intuitive, scalable digital solutions that have transformed how private market and hedge fund investments are bought and sold. With iCapital, financial advisors, wealth managers, and asset managers around the world now have access to everything they need to deliver the return and diversification potential of alternatives to high net worth investors. To learn more, visit iCapital.com.
In this episode, Bill is joined by Chrysanthy Vakla, Deputy CEO of Susten, for an in-depth discussion on sustainable energy and its future. Chrys, with her extensive background in finance and venture capital, shares her insights on the dynamic landscape of renewable energy and climate technology. The conversation covers Chrys's professional journey from the concept of energy transition to the role of venture capital in fostering innovative energy solutions. Listen in.
Chrysanthy Vakla, welcome to Educational Alpha.
Nice to be here, Bill. Thank you for having me.
The pleasure's mine. So we've talked a little bit about energy and climate and sustainable energy on this platform before, but this is probably going to be the deepest dive, and you're the Deputy CEO of Susten, which the name implies sustainable energy. So we're going to get into that quite a bit in the course of this conversation, and very timely and topical subject matter for sure. But maybe a little bit of your background, because as best I can tell, you came up the wealth management space. And I think Susten as a standalone organization is just about 5 years old, but I know it has a longer history. So maybe take us through the journey that led you there.
Yeah, sure. I was born and raised in Greece, and I studied finance and worked as an equity analyst for a short time. And after my MBA in Dublin, I moved to London to pursue a career in banking. I guess I was attracted to the idea of living and working in big financial centers, and London served that purpose for me. My career has mainly been in investment banking, where I spent about 15 years mainly working in the hedge fund space. Throughout the ups and downs of the crisis in 2008 was quite of a pivotal moment for me. Yeah, you're right. Wealth management became a passion for me later on. In 2015, I moved in private wealth in Credit Suisse and later on Royal Bank of Canada. And there I built relationships with individual investors and families and learned a lot about investment psychology and myself, what I value, what I appreciate, how people can channel their capital to make a difference to themselves, to their families, to their communities. And then we had the pandemic, and I feel that in 2022, coming out of the pandemic, I felt an urge to follow my own passion. And my passion was in startup companies. I was fascinated by the world of venture capital investing. I remember I was giving advice to junior people joining us in RBC. I remember me saying that if I was to start my career again, I would probably join the VC space. And there was a click at some point, feeling actually there's never too late to follow your passion, especially when you can leverage some things you can build and put it all into a good purpose, good cause. And if anything, I think going from large corporate organizations to a venture capital firm focusing on climate tech, energy transition, if anything, it helps me inspire my children who now can understand what I do. It's a little bit easier to explain what you do when it's something so practical that affects day-to-day lives. So I joined Susten. I joined a team of energy experts focusing on climate tech in the end of 2021.
Before we get to Susten, I think you had described yourself to me as a digital nomad, which is an interesting way to describe oneself. But I guess maybe out of every crisis has to come some good and some positive. And maybe one of the few dividends COVID gave us is the ability to become a digital nomad. So are you now fully stationed back in Greece? Are you more of a nomad wandering around the Eurozone? I think it's the former, not the latter.
Indeed. So I've now done a full circle. So 20 years in banking in London. I guess the attractiveness of the big city is still there. But coming after the pandemic, I felt the need to be closer to my roots, somewhere warmer. And COVID made it possible. COVID made it possible to marry well being and career. So I'm now based in Athens, about 3/4 of my time. I do travel quite a lot with work. I'm exploring opportunities here in Greece. I think there's a tremendous potential that Southern Europe has in the space that I operate, which is green energy. And yeah, I guess I enjoy the 300 days of sunshine in the year while I do get to travel and see the team more often.
And Susten, does it have a headquarters? And if so, is it London or are all the employees nomadic?
It's in London. So our core team is in London and Cambridge. Our CEO is based in Switzerland. I'm based in Athens together with a COO. And we spend at least a week every month working together from one of our locations. We also have an office in Cyprus, which is more of our middle office. And we also spend time over there.
I think when we get to energy, renewable or otherwise, a lot of people have their opinions. Some of them are based on facts and some are not. And it can be a very polarizing discussion. And there's some things that maybe are not subject to interpretation because they are black and white. And you would think energy transition would have one universal definition. Maybe it doesn't. But Chrys, how would you define the term energy transition? What does it mean from a Susten standpoint?
Bill, you're very right. It's similar a little bit to the ESG term, how something that started with the best intentions often becomes subject of criticism and fiery debates. So energy transition, in just a few seconds, this is us switching from the usual oil and gas to a bunch of cleaner options like wind, solar, hydro, and even some cool new tech to help the planet. And this comes with policies, it comes with targets, and some of them are realistic, others not so, or they ignore the fact that we cannot miraculously switch off the oil tap and expect 9 billion people to figure out how to utilize green energy in an affordable way in the next decade or so. And this has created ambiguity, it has created frustration and some cynicism in the term from investment community, from politicians, from lots of different parts of the society. So I don't believe that in fast energy transition at all costs. I believe in a thoughtful and pragmatic transition where technology, maybe over and above policy, is likely to lead the way. And this is the space that we're focusing on at Susten.
We're not going to get into the inner workings of the various COP events. I know it just finished up in Dubai. But one of the things I saw coming out of that is the big oil is now on board. What that means, I don't know. I think oftentimes these are signatories on a pledge as opposed to a prescriptive agreement to do X, Y, and Z. But it seems to be a very clear indication that we have to get to the other side, which is a better and more renewable energy. And in order to do that, a lot of things are in movement, not the least of which is investment and the infrastructure to get there. And it's interesting, I think your area of expertise at Susten seems to be starting on the VC space to some degree. I know it's public and private equity. I want to cover that as well. But if I think about disruption and a lot of capital moving, getting some opportunity at the early part of that pipe around value creation in the VC space, I think is very interesting. So maybe talk about some of the things you're seeing in that space and why you find it so very interesting.
I think, Bill, you hit the nail on the head. And coming out of COP28, you find the investment community, the whole world will take a different view. Some will feel it's too little, too late. Others will see the oil majors making some very brave steps that are a little bit more pragmatic, practical, realistic. And we just have to pick and choose what we feel we can connect with. This investing is hugely important part of energy transition. Often when people refer to energy transition, they might think of large infrastructure projects and big investments requiring lots of governmental support and collaboration. But if we take a step back a little bit and now look into these companies that will become the component, the innovation, the technology of what is required for us to achieve what we achieve, I think This is where we'll understand that we can focus our energy, passion, debate in something really practical that nobody can deny. And that is the role of technology in us moving to a more viable and sustainable space. I think VCs play a catalytic role in that for various reasons. Firstly, early stage companies, often backed by VCs, the forefront of developing innovative technologies, which are important components for these large scale energy products. And these startups frequently introduce cutting edge solutions that can make renewable energy projects more efficient and economically viable, accelerating the transition to a cleaner energy source. These companies are not burdened by the bureaucratic procedures that we often find in large organizations or regulatory policies, which sometimes can slow down innovative thinking. And we're talking about university labs, incubators, scientists, ex-utility teams that will now focus their vision into something super practical and all ready to dedicate talent and expertise in efficient ways. But I think we shouldn't also ignore the role of the LPs into that space, the limited partners in VC funds, the investors. They can play a crucial role. Their investments in VC funds that support green technologies send a strong market signal, and it helps drive a broader movement towards decarbonization. This alignment of investment strategies with climatic goals is not just beneficial for the planet, it creates new market opportunities and drives innovation. And that can have, not to be too philosophical about it, but it can have a ripple effect of creating a community of well-educated LPs in an often misunderstood space, which is energy transition. So LPs really getting the ins and outs of the green scene is a double win. They're not just savvy investors, they become smart consumers too. These folks will start to see through the fluff in products and politics. They can spot the difference between what's really eco-friendly and what's just for show. And the Switchstone LPs often share what they know with their families, friends, and even their own companies. So they're like the influencers in their own circles, showing others how to be smart about going green. They can teach their kids, they can teach their colleagues how to make better choices. So it's like helping build a whole army of eco-wise consumers. And that's something that I've seen happening and achieving by firms starting investing into smaller companies in technology in the VC space.
I want to follow up on the VCs themselves, your LPs, and then maybe the size of money in play in terms of this transition. And starting maybe with the VCs first. It's interesting when you talk about your background, and I think about the family offices. In many ways, they're the most innovative and the first mover because they've got a long-term commitment. They want to invest alongside their beliefs. They're not looking to give any kind of concessionary returns, but they have that horizon and that view. Are your LPs family offices and wealth management clients, or are they more institutional LPs, a mix of both?
It's a mix of both, but lately we're gaining a lot of traction with corporates as LPs in the space of corporate venture capital as a service. We find that both family offices and corporates have strategic objectives that are long-term. If we look at families about building the legacy, if we look at corporates, aligning a venture fund with the strategic objectives of your organization is crucially important. And there are more and more players into that space, understanding that if you don't have a venture team on the ground, it makes sense to partner up with a venture fund and outsource it. Let's take, for example, some of the industry players or some of the industries that don't have the talent and the resources on the ground to go out and map the landscape and find innovative solutions or talk to universities around the world. Now, they could become fundamentally important and help small companies grow, scale, do pilots with them. It's a way for them to see themselves both as investors and business partners of these technologies that can help them build a competitive advantage in the markets they operate. So I see the growth CVC as a service. I think there are a lot less of these firms than the VCs of the world. VCs now, I was looking at about 1,000 VC funds in the US and maybe half of that in the UK. The CVC is a much smaller universe because it comes with a specialization, and you require the team to really understand the industry you operate as a client and also be able to go scoop the market and create a portfolio for you. So that's an area that I think will see quite a lot of growth. In the area of climate tech, again, there is great potential, and there's never been a bigger need to collaborate. I know VCs tend to be like lots of alternative fund managers. Sometimes they operate in silos, but when it comes to innovation, when it comes to the need to go under the surface to understand how you're going to do due diligence of this thing that might not have the straightforward science behind it, it's hugely important to join forces with co-investors. And VC space is growing massively.
If I think about the target investments, the VC investee companies themselves, where are they based, and do you have a sort of target size or business model they're focused on, the continuum of sustainable energy?
In terms of the location, we favor Europe over US at the moment. Firstly, our team is based in Europe, and practically speaking, we need to be close to our portfolio companies since we are spending time with them to help them in their growth path in additional ways to just giving capital. So we really need to be close to the teams, not just for the due diligence, but also to follow their growth. Secondly, Europe has an existential need for energy independence. This creates a strong political and economic impetus for investing in domestic renewable energy sources. Therefore, there is a strong regulatory support, and that typically what follows from that is capital allocation by both European institutions and also global institutions. And thirdly, the renewable market in Europe is quite mature, and this presents opportunities for scaling up and innovating in existing technologies. Now, in terms of the stage we're mostly interested in, we acknowledge the fact that climate tech is a very difficult space to operate as an investor, mainly because there is what we call tech risk. So how can we now minimize the risk? How can we still get exposure to the winners of tomorrow in that space without opening ourselves to his investment risk? We typically look into products where the technology is proven and they require our help to scale and grow. Clearly, there is macro risk in anything you invest into, and occasionally we can favor asset-light solutions that are resilient to inflationary environment. That doesn't mean that capital-intensive companies do not have a time and place in portfolios, but when it comes to that, we pay more attention to operational efficiency, the estimated runway. Then we look at balance sheet, we scrutinize financial projections, basically for common sense, for reasonableness. We look at flexible cost structures that allow the company to scale resources up or reduce costs down as needed. In terms of commercial risk, we look for proven demand. We go to an extent of actually verifying the demand before we even start looking into which solutions exist out there to meet that demand. We prefer firms that maintain multiple distribution channels and partnerships. We look for resilient sales channels, and we evaluate key person risk as well. We often find that it's really often the CEO that does most of the sales. So we really look into the people. We look into who is going to be the captain of the ship that will drive the company through all the ups and downs, especially in that space. And then the way we might invest could vary. It could be gradually, we build trust in the company and then we allocate more capital. It could be coming in a little bit earlier and then benefiting from the growth. But ultimately, it comes from the understanding that what will require us to move into a cleaner energy space is really technology, capital, and policies. Now, we can't influence policies. We could help channel capital, but our space is really tech. So how can we start from top bottom, understand what are the bottlenecks out there in the world that stops us from using these cleaner forms of energy, and then going and trying to find what solutions might be out there, who is doing what, where they're based, what are the teams, and then really spend most of our focus assessing business risk. Is the management capable of navigating the space? Do we trust them? Is the transparency in the way they communicate with investors. So things like that are hugely important for us. They set the right tone, the right behavior. We really need to trust the values, the ethos, the work ethics, the history of the team, diversity of the team. Everything becomes hugely important because people buy people, and it's not going to be an easy road. And we want to make sure that they have what it takes to take you to the other side.
That all makes sense. And maybe to stick on the same theme on the investment thesis, process, and philosophy, maybe talk a little bit about, Chrys, your holding period. If I think about VC and maybe more specifically private equity, maybe a 5 to on the long end, maybe 7-year holding period. How patient is this capital? And then maybe if I can compound one other part to this question, talk about what a successful exit would look like. And maybe you haven't had many given the short age of Susten itself, but you must have a vision as to what you would expect a successful exit to look like. So holding period and exits.
Yeah, and it really varies. And you're right. When we look into private equity investing, you have to take a long-term view. Having said that, we often see that this market is going through massive consolidation, especially when it comes to climate tech and services to renewable operators. We see that there are bigger groups being created that they constantly look to absorb new technologies and new teams. So it's not surprising sometimes when you invest into a company and a couple of years later, if not lots sooner, they become a target for acquisition. So we see exits taking place lots sooner in that space than probably in other sectors. It doesn't come without a risk. It is also likely you have to wait for 5, 6, and more years till you have a successful exit. But by that point, you hope the valuation compensates you and your patience is being justified. And then it depends on the macro, as we discussed. Is the macro environment supporting for teams that require higher capex to carry on till they get commercialized and till they scale up? And that's a big risk that the investment community sometimes takes. So there is a shift to some asset-light solutions out there without completely discounted some exceptional hardware that we have come across and will become very prominent in the field they operate.
I believe either you mentioned it or maybe I saw it on the website that it seems like you bring this philosophy forward in the VC space, the private equity space, but then also public equity. And is that a bit of an activism play or an engagement play? How do you bring forward this thesis in the public markets?
The public markets are more of the bread and butter of the team and the whole history of the team, starting as utility experts more than 20 years ago, was built in managing large institutional funds in the listed space. What we find is that marrying the two creates enormous amount of synergies. And when you're looking into new technologies, early stage companies, in order to assess the entry point, in order to get a better view of the valuation, or even understanding how you're moving up on the supply chain, you can't really ignore what's happening in the listed space. We have a separate portfolio where we invest in small cap and mid cap listed equity, again in the energy transition space in Europe. And that helps us in many ways. First of all, you can help network and connect early stage companies with listed companies who can become a natural supplier or client and so on. Secondly, as investor, you get a sense of what is the risk I'm taking here? How far do I want to go up the valuation to ignore the liquidity risk I'm taking? So having a view on alternatives in that space, when it's alternatives, I'm talking about how else you can get exposure into these things, I think makes you a more sensible and considerate investor. We did think deep and hard whether we should choose which path to go. And eventually the decision became quite obvious that it's really important to keep an eye on both sides of the spectrum.
As part of that, are you doing anything in the debt space, either as leverage on the private market side or anything in green bonds, or is that somebody else's mission and not yours?
We haven't looked into that as yet. We have issued and looked at convertible loans as a way to invest into companies, but we haven't looked into the green bond space.
Two other things I want to cover before we sign off, Chrys, and one maybe I should have started with was really what are we talking about in terms of the size of this market? And I just saw a stat right before we came on, which you can take the other side of, but I think it was Barclays that talked about the cost of this energy transition, and they sized it between $1 and $300 trillion needs to be spent between now and 2050. So if you divide that by 25 years, still we're talking about some pretty substantial numbers here. If you think about sizing sustainable energy or energy transition, are there some facts that could bring maybe some realistic or realism to what we're talking about here? I think regardless, it is a big opportunity and a big number.
Indeed. And Bill, you're right. It's a multi-trillion market, and it's expected to grow nearly 10% annually till 2030, or basically in the next decade. But let me narrow my response to the tech side of things rather than the whole size of energy transition, which also includes large infrastructure projects. So according to the International Renewable Energy Agency, we're looking at around 35 trillion in cumulative investments is required just in the next 5-6 years. Last year only, we had a record of 1.5 trillion. To keep with Paris Agreement targets, this needs to quadruple. Investment opportunities are diverse. They range from renewable energy technologies in wind and solar power to innovations in energy storage, which is a big focus for us, and efficient grid infrastructure. The focus is clearly on reducing carbon emissions. So I can't think of any large infrastructure project of any type taking place in future that you're not looking at carbon emissions at the same time. So this number is probably augmented by the fact that it's going to be topical in every investment taking place in the future, and for good reason.
And is there any one definitive set of resource or information, not in infomercials so much, but Preqin is a good friend of Kaya's, and they've been on this platform as well. And when I think about research in the private markets, Preqin is a definitive source. But you have UNPRI, SASB, the list goes on and on. If you think about definitive set of research and thought process, is there one sort of market clearing name that comes to mind?
There are the ones you mentioned. Bloomberg NEF is the other one, which is a great source of information. I think that the more we start collaborating and the more that comes out of universities that we can share in the open market, the better for everyone. But you're right. I mean, there are some very good sources of information. Preqin is one of them. And organizations like Kaya, they help the participants not taking polarized views on things like the market we operate, not just as a size, but what we're here to do, why we bother. And hopefully helps all of us become a little bit more savvy, sensible, and pragmatic when it comes to investing into that space.
I appreciate you using Kaya in that vein. So thank you for that. I'm not going to take the other side and accept the compliments. So thank you. And we do try. There is no one definitive source, but I think the more that we can collaborate and cooperate together, I think the better. So maybe last topic, Chrys, geopolitical risk. It is everywhere we look. A lot of disruption in supply chains, a lot of disruption in the commodity plays. You have some of the biggest oil producing countries like Saudi Arabia. You must think about geopolitical risks in your investing and your investee companies around your exits. And I assume that's probably a newer part of the calculus, or maybe not. But how do you think about geopolitical risk, and how does that factor into not only the risks, but maybe the opportunities you see out there too?
Sometimes geopolitical risk, it's practical and it can impact your investment decisions in indirect ways. Inflationary pressures, energy cost, commodity cost, all of that can really impact the viability of firms that are not established yet and that don't have huge revenues to fall into. Sometimes, however, it creates noise. We lose track of what's important and what matters the most. And especially when it comes to innovation, it's always going to be here, it's always going to be important, it's always going to be a component that we need and can rely on. And we just have to think, how can we help these companies navigate a space that has lots of turmoil to actually become growth and established in the areas that they operate? And the same goes with politics and geopolitical situations. You spoke about oil majors, you spoke about Saudi. Of course, we need everyone to look into that and pull every resource we need And who is going to back these innovative solutions? Of course, some of that will come, if not most of it, from the oil majors, that we need to effectively look into a realistic way and support the effort that they need to put so we can all transition in a sustainable way.
That makes great sense. And I think this movie is going to continue. We used to have a unipolarity approach, maybe with the US sitting there, and it could be, as one of our guests described it, as a schoolyard bully. And that bully shook you down, and at least you know where you stood. Now you get beat up by one bully, and there's another bully someplace else, and they're not afraid to bully one, and off we go. I don't know if that's good or bad. It's different. And being aware of that is, I think, critically important as to not only how we conduct our lives, but also as an investor. So maybe finishing with deference to your home country, Chrys. One of the decks I use with my colleague, Laura Malini, who put us together in the first place, I use this with students around the world. And the very last slide I have in there is a bust of a Greek physician, more commonly known as Hippocrates, the father of modern day medicine. And there's a Hippocratic oath, which really speaks to professionalism. It's around transparency and putting the patient first, putting the client first, putting the prospect first. And I think when it comes to renewable energy, sustainable energy transition, there's a lot we know, a lot we don't know. And there's a lot of money in play and a lot of movement. And I think you also mentioned Kaya as one example, but I think we need to have Kaya and folks like you and Susten, people that are willing to admit that this is uncharted territory to a large degree. And you got to invest in a thoughtful way with purpose. I think that first dollar in maybe has more risk attached to it, but maybe more opportunity as well, because this is a space that's going to be growing very rapidly. So I think there is going to be a lot of very good stories and outcomes as we come to the other side. When I think about success, I'm going to think about your country. I'm going to be thinking about Hippocrates, and I'm going to be thinking about you as well. So thank you for a great discussion. And I hope we have a chance to meet the next time I'm over in the Eurozone.
Oh, thank you very much, Bill. I would love to welcome you in Athens anytime that you find yourself here.
How do you say educational alpha in Greek? Does it translate?
Alpha is alpha, and educational is, I would say, epimorphotiko. Epimorphotiko alpha.
Okay. I may need the phonetics on that, but I'm going to see if I can work that into a hashtag when we release this. So, Chrys, thanks again.
Lovely talking to you. Thank you, Bill.
Thank you for listening to Educational Alpha. I'm your host, Bill Kelly. Learn more about the Kaya Association and subscribe to the show at kaya.org. That's CAIA.org. See you next time.